We're going to get started now with Matt Friedman's remarks. But first, before I introduce him, I wanted to thank you all for coming. And also, I'm Jody Schneider with Bloomberg News, sorry, and a member of the professional committee. So let me now move on to introduce Matt Friedman, who's our speaker today. He's an author and he's CEO of the Mekong Club. And he's going to talk to us about an important topic: how can we win the fight against modern slavery? I think you're going to find this not only, it's sobering and it's a painful topic, but he is an optimist, he told me just over lunch, and he's going to give us some good news on this front. And there's good news for Hong Kong. Hong Kong is stepping up. The private sector in Hong Kong is stepping up and helping in this fight. So he's going to tell us about that. But first, he's going to tell us about the sobering facts, that every 4 seconds another human being is forced into modern slavery. And people in Hong Kong living among us have been forced into modern slavery. He's going to talk to us about what is working, what is not working, and what needs to be done to address this problem. He's interviewed hundreds of freed slaves throughout Southeast Asia for his new book, Where Were You? A Profile of Modern Slavery. Matt Friedman has been the regional project manager of the UN Interagency Project on Human Trafficking in Thailand. He's worked for USAID in Thailand, Bangladesh, and Nepal, and he's helped establish a counter-trafficking regional training center and produced 2 award-winning international films about sex trafficking. He will discuss this topic with us, and then we will have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end, and I hope you'll all think of some good questions while he's speaking. Here's Matt Friedman. Thank you.
Okay, so basically the title of the talk is Modern Slavery and the Business Response, but I'll be initially starting off with kind of a summation of what you need to know in order to address modern slavery. Then after that, I'll talk about how did this become relevant to the private sector, and then segue into what is happening here in Hong Kong to address this particular issue. But to begin with, when most people think about human trafficking, this is what they think of, the picture in the top left, forced prostitution, for good reason. My first exposure to this was 27 years ago. I was living and working in Nepal. I was a public health officer. My job was to translate resources into healthier people. At that time, I was finding girls 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive. Now, if you know anything about Nepal, it's a very conservative culture. We shouldn't have had that group of people with this disease. So we went to go and interview them. And what we found was that many of them told the same story over and over again. And the story went something like this. Trafficker, guy around 20 years old, would go into the community, flash a bunch of money around. He wanted everyone to think he was rich. He'd then say, I'm looking for a wife. Don't want an urban wife. They're too difficult. I want a village wife. Find a 12-year-old girl, go up to the family and say, I want to marry your daughter. In Nepal, they marry young, so it wasn't so unusual. Family's thrilled. Wow, he's going to take care of our daughter, he's going to take care of us. But that isn't what is going to happen. 2 days later, they get married. And then he says to the family, don't worry, I'm going to go off to Kathmandu for 3 months with your daughter, but I'll be back. But instead, he takes her to Mumbai, India. Now, this girl's never been more than 10 kilometers away from her house. When she's in Mumbai, she thinks she's still in Nepal. Takes her to the red light district, puts her in a brothel, says, honey, stay here, I'll be back in a few minutes. Her initial response is, no, don't leave me. It's okay, you just stay here. He then goes off to the madam to get the $500 for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold from the wedding, and he hands the wedding pictures over to her. After that, he goes to Nepal to do this again and again. The madam then goes into the room where the girl is and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with between 10 and 15 guys a day because I say so. You can imagine her shock. My husband loves me. He wouldn't do that. Well, that's what happens. When she begins to internalize this, many of them say, I kill myself before I do those shameful things. The madam then basically says, here's a picture of your wedding. Is this your mom, your dad, your brother? If you hurt yourself, we'll hurt them. After that, to make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You simply shame her. So they bring in 1 or 2 professional rapists. These guys will rape this girl 30 times, 40 times in a 2-day period, until eventually she just lays back and accepts whatever happens to her. For 2 years, she's in a situation where she'll be with between 10 and 15 guys a day. That means that she's literally commercially raped 7,000 times by the time that she's 14 years old. So I was hearing this story over and over again, but I didn't understand the evil of it until I actually went to those brothels. I was invited by the Indian government to do public health checks. I'm going from brothel to brothel. I had a police officer with me. I went into one of the brothels, and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. This girl saw me, saw an opportunity, literally ran up, wrapped herself around me and said, save me, they're doing terrible things to me. I turned to the police officer. I said, we need to get this girl out. He said, you can't do that. So what are you talking about? You're a cop. He says, well, if you try to leave with her, they'll kill us both. To make a long story short, we left. We came back with a lot more police, but of course she was gone. I tell this story because I wasn't one of those 15-year-olds that said, when I grow up, I want to be a human trafficking expert. In fact, I did everything I could not to be. But every once in a while, we get tested in life. I failed this test miserably, and I surrendered to the fact that now that I know about this, this is what I'm going to do with my life. But it's not just women and girls, it's men and boys. You see in the top right, this is a fishing trawler in Thailand. The story behind this is a Cambodian boy hears that there's work in Thailand. He's maybe 14, 15 years old. Told by his family that he needs to raise some money. He's looking around for work, looking around, can't find it, running out of money. Trafficker in the community sees this, goes up to him and says, hey brother, you're from Cambodia, I'm from Cambodia. Let me give you some money. Let me help you out. But guess what? I got this job. You don't have to worry about it. I'm going to bring you down to the ocean. I'm going to put you on a boat. The boat's going to go out for 3 months. You'll come back and you'll make lots of money. Takes him to the ocean. Puts him on the boat. Boat goes out, but it stays out for 4 years. This guy will work 18, 19 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten, he gets tortured. The only food he's going to eat is rice and fish. They give him strong stimulants, drugs, to stimulate his body to work hard. If he gets ill, if he gets injured, throw him off the boat. At the end of the 4 years, boat comes in. Guy says to the captain, give me something. Captain says, go away. You're illegally in my country. Guy says, I'll go to the police. Captain says, go ahead. We own the police. That's another form of human trafficking. The bottom left is a factory called Ranya Pao. Story behind this is a person from Myanmar hears that there's work in this factory. Knocks on the door. Factory owner comes out and says, what do you want? Guy says, I'm looking for a job. Factory owner says, okay, I'll give you a job. I'll pay you the equivalent of $50 US, but you have to stay in the factory. This guy has never made more than $25 a month. He's thrilled. He immediately accepts the job. Goes into the factory, works under horrific conditions, but at least he knows he'll be able to send money home. After about 2 months, he goes to the factory owner, says, I'd like to be paid. Factory owner says, well, I forgot to mention one thing. Costs $54 US for you to be here. I'm only paying you $50. So in fact, you owe me money. So all of those people were languishing in a situation for years where every day they worked, they got deeper and deeper into debt. Once a month, they would take one of these people to the back, beat them until they were bloody, take a photograph of it and show it to everyone to say, if you try to leave, this will happen to you and to your family. Last picture is a construction site. All across Asia, you have certain low-skilled jobs on construction sites. A migrant goes up to the construction foreman and says, I'd like a job. Foreman says, okay, I'll give you a job, but I can't pay you for the first 6 months. This person is thrilled. I'm going to get a job. He looks trustworthy. I'll do this work. 6 months goes by. He goes and asks for his money. Foreman says, well, I need another 2 months. And then another 2 months. And then another 2 months. He had no intention of ever paying this guy. Of course, this guy's borrowing money, so his stress level's going up. When it gets too stressful, they just call the immigration police, pick this guy up, deport him. They get a year or two of free labor. That's another form of human trafficking. Okay, so for 27 years now, the terminology that we use is called human trafficking. Why? Because you had people going from often one country to another, and so the movement, like drug trafficking, like arms trafficking, was considered important, so you use the word trafficking. Gradually over time, people said, well, wait a minute. What if a person goes from one province to another? Isn't that also bad? Or what if you go from one side of the street and you enter into a slavery circumstance? So eventually people said, we have to move away from trafficking because it isn't just about movement to something that reflects the exploitation. And so the word slavery was used. But when you use slavery, people think about what happened 150 years ago. They're not thinking about what's happening today, so they put the word modern there. Why modern slavery? Well, if you don't get paid, you can't leave. If there's threats, if there's debt, if there's violence, what else do we call it? So that's the reason why we're seeing the word modern slavery being used more and more as the terminology for this. Okay, so slavery. Sometimes when I use this word, people look at me like I have 3 heads. They'll say, come on, Matt. There can't be that many slaves in the world, right? Well, according to the Slavery Index, there's over 40 million people in slavery around the world. There's more slaves than there are Canadians. There are more slaves today than any other time in history. 66% of these people are in Asia for 2 reasons. There are a lot of people in Asia. Second, the feudal systems and the exploitative systems that have been in place have never really been completely dismantled. Go to Beijing, very modern city. Go 20 kilometers outside of it, you're going to find some highly exploitative situations that have never been completely dismantled. So let's talk about Hong Kong for a minute. Up until this morning, the Hong Kong government said we don't really have modern slavery, and they denied it for a long time. According to the Slavery Index, there's about 29,000 people in slavery in Hong Kong. About half of them would be in forced prostitution, out of the 100,000 prostitutes in Hong Kong. And the other half would be domestic helpers who, prior to even coming to Hong Kong, are indebted with debt bondage. They're given a certain amount of money, they sign an agreement, they don't understand what the agreement is, so they end up working for years in Hong Kong and they don't get paid anything at all because they're basically being cheated. So what happened this morning? Well, the Hong Kong government indicated that they were going to have an action plan. And so they went from, we don't have human trafficking, to this morning saying, okay, well, maybe we do, and these are the things that we're going to do to address it. I will be the first person to congratulate the Hong Kong government. I can't think of a single negative thing to say because I'm thrilled that they're finally doing this. Give them a round of applause, okay? And irrespective of all those years of the pain and suffering and trying to get them to do it, and they'll work on shelters, they'll work on a whole variety of other things. Basically, I don't want you to read this other than just, there was some text associated with it. 23-page document, for which I have a copy of it here. Okay, so when it comes to the rate of exploitation, about 9.2 million people entering per year, about 25,200 per day, and the time it takes us to have this talk, another 1,000 people, or as has already been indicated, a new slave every 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, a new slave, and so on, and so on. The drum beats on. When it comes to a breakdown between adults and children, about a quarter of the cases are children, the rest are adults. Most people think that human trafficking is really about forced prostitution. That only represents about a quarter of the cases. The rest are forced labor. Now, this is where it comes back to us. You know, when it comes to human trafficking and the applicability of it, sex trafficking to us, it's really hard to make a connection for most people. But out of the forced labor number, 60% of those individuals are associated with supply chains. So as consumers, we buy stuff. And a certain percentage of the things that we buy are tainted with modern slavery. So that's part of the reason why all of a sudden you're seeing this transition of this issue that used to be very public sector switching over to the private sector. And I'll go into that in more detail. So how does the process work? Well, I'm going to offer you a job. I'll pay you $2 million a year. You only have to work 4 days a week, 2-hour lunches. I'll give you 3 months of vacation, a house, a car, and basically you can live anywhere in the world you want. Are you interested? Anyone else? How many of you were thinking, sounds too good to be true? Well, it is, because I'd take that job before I'd give it to you. Okay, so, but imagine if you're a person and you've never made more than $1 a day. Somebody comes up to you and says, I'll give you $2. And instead of working 16 and a half hours, you only have to work 15 hours. And guess what? I'll give you 2 hours off on Sunday. But you have to make the decision right now. Can't go home, got to make it right now. Person's thinking, sounds too good to be true. But they know that there are people out there making $2 a day, US. They know that this might be the only time they get a deal. So most people feel like they can't say no. They say yes, they get taken away. The second is debt. So let's say that you needed 1,500 Hong Kong dollars for an operation, part of a low socioeconomic situation. You come to me, I give you that money. A couple of days later, you, after a successful operation, try to give me 2,000 back with interest. 2,000, 20,000. You look at me and say, well, that's not fair. I'm a criminal. I don't have to be fair. We didn't talk about the agreement. You either do it or something bad's going to happen to you or a family member. That's how people get into this situation. It's that easy. It can be over even in Bangladesh, $10 US. Person is basically locked into something like this. When it comes to the organizations, and there's supposed to be addressing this, supposed to be governments, but a lot of governments don't like this topic. Government of China, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore don't like to be admitting that there are slaves there. Same in the UK and the United States. So things happen, but not nearly as much as they should. I worked for the United Nations for 6 years. Put my hand on my heart when I say this. I believe in the UN system. But I spent a lot of time in 5-star hotels, eating really good food, talking about poverty. There was a real disconnect between what we were doing and what we should have been doing. So it's the NGOs that are doing the lion's share of the work. But when we go back to the statistics, out of the 40 million people, 75% of them in forced labor, 60% of them associated with supply chains, we need the private sector involved. But if you think governments don't like this topic, private sector hates it. Because they're often on the receiving end of somebody pointing the finger and saying that you guys are so greedy that you're using slaves in order to basically have shareholder dividends. Now, any responsible company would do anything and everything they could not to be associated with this, but the general public doesn't think that. And so oftentimes the private sector is caught in this net of innuendo and accusations and so forth. Okay, so talked a little bit about the extent of the problem, talked a little bit about what's being done. Now I want to talk about how many people were helped last year and how many criminals went to jail. So out of 40 million people, think about what a good number would be. And out of 500,000 criminals, how many people do you think we put in jail? Here it is. We helped about 66,000 people last year, 0.2%. Put about 7,000 criminals in jail, 0.8%. Now, When you look at that, you might think that the counter-trafficking world is lazy, we don't work hard enough. That's really not the issue. The issue is the profits generated from modern slavery are 150 billion US dollars a year. The amount of money that goes into addressing it, 0.23% or 350 million. In the United States, we eat $6 billion worth of potato chips. It takes 21 days of potato chip eating in the United States to come up with the amount of money that's used globally to address modern slavery. In addition to that, there's about 15,000 do-gooder types like me and 500,000 greed-incentivized criminals. You can see the difference between the size there. And lastly, because of the clandestine nature of what we're dealing with here, it's hidden. And so a lot of people don't see it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the relevance of this to the business world. Why would banks be interested in this? Well, if any of that $150 billion makes it into a legitimate bank, it's money laundering. So the banks have to care about this. Why would the manufacturers care? Well, if somebody does an expose on the fact that a particular factory uses slave labor and it happens to be a branded item, they're going to be named and shamed. That's why they care about it. Why would retailers care about it? Well, if you're a Costco or a Tesco or a Walmart, you buy a bunch of stuff. Sometimes you buy things that might be tainted. So there's a lot of major lawsuits that are against these organizations. Why would hotels care? Well, they have forced prostitution that could exist. They have supply chains as well. They have third-party contracts that clean places and so forth. So that's the relevance to them. Okay, so when you stop and look at the business response, there's basically two schools of thought here. One school basically says, okay, why don't we create a business risk and then use that business risk as a means of getting the corporations to do things. And so you see legislation that's being put in place. California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, the UK Modern Slavery Act. Those acts basically say corporations have to say on their website what they're doing to address the issue. We see the fact that lawsuits are taking place. Mars, Nestle's, Marriott, a whole variety of different organizations have been sued at different times for the possible association with modern slavery. We see the news coverage of this increasing significantly, almost doubling every year for the last 4 years. For whatever reason, this issue is the issue of our time. And lastly, a lot of campaigning, where organizations will go and basically say, we think that this particular company is bad, and they will get 8 million people to sign a petition or to send a letter. And so much of the emphasis has been on forcing corporations to do what they need to do. The impact of this is it chills the private sector to the extent that they don't want to have anything to do with it. The only thing they focus on is the business risk, and they don't step up and be part of the solution because they're afraid if they raise their head, somebody's going to say, are you doing this because you feel that you have to because there's a problem? And so, for the most part, the environmental movement went in this direction, and that's the direction that we see a portion of the responders going in. But there's an alternative to this, and this is the alternative that I feel is more productive at this time. To basically educate the private sector, get them to understand the issue and to be a part of kind of the discourse and the discussion, to use their innovation, and then to bring the private sector community together to work in a positive, supportive, creative way to address the issue. So instead of a boycott that says don't buy from a company because they're bad, we emphasize a boycott, which says buy from a company because they're doing all the right things and they're supporting activities and so forth. The hope and expectation is that we can recast the private sector from being fearful of naming and shaming to being heroic, and to have them use their skills, their networks, their people, and so forth in order to basically be a part of the solution. So this is the approach that we've been focusing on. Now, when I first came to Hong Kong, people would say mission impossible. Nobody in Hong Kong cares. And just to read some of the comments, Hong Kong only cares about money. Hong Kong would use slaves for profit. Hong Kong doesn't care about human rights, et cetera, et cetera. I heard this over and over again. That's why we came to Hong Kong, because we figured if this was the place that had the least amount of potential, why wouldn't we work here? In reality, not true. I've met so many people in Hong Kong who, when they hear this message, first thing they say is, what can I do? Companies step up, individuals step up. So, I mean, this idea that you can have almost a cliche summation of a culture simply because people say it over and over again, it's just not true. Okay, so what's actually happening here in Hong Kong? Well, the organization that I work with is called the Mekong Club. The Mekong Club has an association model where we bring the private sector together to allow the private sector to identify the issue and come up with the suggestions of what needs to be done to address it. So we have 4 working groups: finance, footwear and apparel, retail, and hospitality. And basically what we do is we bring these groups together 4 times a year. They discuss and debate, and then they come up with suggestions on what can and should be done to address this issue. So some of the tools that were developed based on these recommendations is we developed an e-learning toolkit. Now, usually e-learning is about 45 minutes. Nobody watches 45 minutes anymore. So we have 15 3-minute films that equals 45 minutes, but they're 3 minutes long. And we have these in multiple languages: Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese, and so forth, because when I go to China, they say, you keep talking to us about modern slavery, but we don't have anything in Mandarin that talks about it. So we developed something that was. And this came from the private sector. The bank said that they wanted a dashboard that took all of the data that was available about the risk in commodities so they could know which commodities are more risky than others. Why do they need to do this? Not to avoid investing in a sector, but to know whether they have to do additional due diligence. So they'll use this, put shrimp, or they'll put in bamboo or whatever, and that's used to basically identify what's needed. Typologies. The typology is used by banks and organizations to take the crime, break it into arrows and boxes to identify the constituent parts associated with the criminal activity that's taking place. Why do you do this? To identify red flags. The banking world is now using artificial intelligence, identifying certain characteristics, and then running it so that they could look at their data to see if there's potentially issues. An example of this would be in the United States, a nail salon that has expenditures taking place at 3 in the morning for $200. So the red flag would be expenditures after hours. That wouldn't work here in Kowloon. You can get your nails done at 2 o'clock in the morning in Kowloon pretty easily. But a modeling company that buys a lot of contraceptives, that's a red flag. We have kind of a search engine that takes all the articles that are out there on this issue for the last 5 years and puts it in one place so that people can search. Why? Because the brands want to know what's happening. And if you try to Google something or use other search engines, you get a lot of garbage. We've taken all of that out. We have a remediation tool. So if your company gets into trouble, what do? We made it simple for them. We developed a flow chart. They can figure out what they need to know. They can pick a box which it describes an element in the flow chart, and the information that they need is at their fingertips. Organizations want to talk about the good work that they're doing. So we developed a best practices repository. This one happens to be for Adidas. We developed this very interesting app. Google gave us some money and worked with Microsoft and some other organizations. The way this works is, so let's say that you're a law enforcement officer in Thailand and you come in contact with a potential victim, but you don't know where that victim comes from. You basically get them to press the flag from where they come from. They press it, and then in that language, there's somebody who says, we are here because we don't know if there's an issue, but we're going to ask you some questions. If the answer to the question is yes, we want you to press the green button. No, press the red button. Are you here against your will? Do you need help? Are you in trouble? So if they press green even once, you know there's an issue. So the private sector was coming together on a regular basis. Finally, they came up and said, well, we want to demonstrate that we are doing all these activities. What can we do as a community? So they came up with a pledge. But then they said, well, for the pledge to be worthwhile and useful, anyone who signs the pledge has to demonstrate that they're doing at least 5 out of 10 categories that are identified. So this was launched a couple of months ago. We already have some major organizations that have signed up, and it demonstrates the commitment. Now, why am I talking about the private sector? Because the NGO world is only helping 0.2%. And even if we doubled or tripled the amount of money or people we had, we'd still be less than 1%. I personally feel that the private sector has a great potential to be the silver bullet that can address these types of issues. And so these are just an example of some of the organizations that we work with here. Just a couple of things that I'll say about the private sector is, number one, you have to have a certain amount of trust. Yeah. Okay, I'll skip that. I'm gonna tell you one more story, and then I'll end. So years ago, I wanted to do something to address the issue of modern slavery. I was in Nepal, decided I was gonna write a book. As part of this book project, I went from shelter to interview the women and the girls. There was one shelter that I went to, there was a girl named Gita, and every time I approached her, she kept saying, no, I don't want to talk to you. But she listened to everything that was being said. Finally, I was leaving. Gita comes running up and says, okay, well, you can have my story. I said, great. After I listened to it, I didn't know what to say. This was the worst story I'd ever heard of rape and torture and betrayal, times 10. Finally, I turned to Gita and I said, wow, Gita, you must be so angry at the traffickers for the terrible things they did to you. She paused and said, no, I'm angry at you. She pointed at me. She kept saying, where were you? Said that every single day she woke up waiting for somebody to come, nobody came. Said she basically wasn't angry at the traffickers. They're just bad people being bad people. Said she was angry at the good people, at society for not caring enough. And I say that because the only way we're going to be able to address this issue is if everybody comes together. If we have an abolitionist movement that has students and faith-based groups and schools and governments and everybody, because what we're dealing with here is so horrific, so terrible, that collectively we all have to take some responsibility. With that, thank you very much. Questions?
Yes.
Oh, it's on? Okay, great. We have time for some questions. When you ask a question, could you please identify yourself and the organization or business you're with? Who would like to start? Okay, I will. There's no one. I will jump right in. So you talked a little bit about how businesses can help, but can you be specific about Hong Kong and what is happening in Hong Kong in the business community?
Okay, there's a lot of need for volunteer support. And you can be a lawyer, it can be a communications person, a human resource person, or just somebody who has some time. We need people to basically contribute resources to the NGOs that are doing this type of work. Just having general awareness. We do, last year we did 174 talks. They're free. We offer to anyone who wants them. Usually we'll talk for about an hour, hour and 15, and then 15 minutes. If your organization's interested, let us know, we'll do it. And within your organization, there'll be a certain number of people who have this desire or this yearning to want to give something back. And we try to link those people up with organizations that need that. And so these are very simple things. You don't have to quit your job and go to Cambodia. You can simply do these things on a part-time basis.
Great. And how can companies, organizations get involved in a larger sense?
Let us know, and we'll go and just have an introductory discussion with them. The work that we're doing in Hong Kong is being expanded. I go to Singapore in an hour after this. We've been to Japan, we've been to Bangladesh, Thailand, and basically we're going into those communities as well, sensitizing them to this. And if enough people want us to come in and do trainings, or if they want the e-learning tools or various other tools, we're happy to work with them to get them made available.
Other questions?
Yes.
Oh. Hi. There's a microphone.
Hi, my name is Rosie. My son started this 24-hour race with his friend to help the victims of trafficking. And they went to all the schools in Hong Kong. And there were lots of kids who were interested. And they started this race like 6 years ago, but now it's gone international, and they've raised millions. It's really, really, really proud of what he did when he was only 18. I would love to get involved. Now he's in US.
Yes.
I mean, he's working and he's not involved in this race. But have you, do you have any plans to go to schools and, educate kids? Because it would be a great idea to.
I know the 24-hour race. I do a lot of talks when they're about to run. I'll do the
Okay,
opening
that was-
talk, so I'm a huge fan of the
Oh, you know
and
that.
congratulations to your son and
Thank
so
you.
forth. It's fantastic. In fact, going up to Singapore and presenting at the American School, the International School, I do faith-based groups. Last year I did about 40 schools. We do something also called a sweatshop simulation. We'll call the kids into the gymnasium. They don't know what's happening. Each one of them is given a nut and bolt and told that for the next 5 hours their classes have been canceled, and they have to put this nut on and off the bolt for that duration of time. If they laugh, if they drop, if they didn't do it fast enough, they get a detention. So for 30 minutes we give out detentions, even if you didn't do anything wrong. After that we say, guess what? Classes aren't canceled. You're not going to get a detention, but how did it feel to lose control for 30 minutes? It's a very effective tool, and it really helps them to understand the pain and suffering of imagining if you were a 14-year-old person working 15 hours a day, every day, and that's your life. They just got a little taste of it. So we do a lot of these school programs. In fact, we just launched an app at the Hong Kong International School. It's on our website, endslavery.com. I think, I don't know what the app, but it basically gives you drop-down menus for things that you can do, and each thing that you do, you get care points. And so, like, if you go to a lecture like this, you get 3 care points. You guys have got it. Okay, if you share it with 5 other people, you get a couple of other. What we found is the gamification of do-gooderness gets people to do stuff because they compare themselves to other. And so we just launched this, CNN launched it on the 14th of March with us over at the school. And it's just our way of kind of, in the school itself, we'll manage the process for 3 months. Middle school, not even high school, middle school. So, and then 3 months after that, we give it to another school and another school. So I absolutely agree with you that this is an important area.
Because when kids get involved, then, I mean, it's good to start from the root level. You know, they'll be so aware. When they grow up, they'll do something about it. So I thought it would be a very good idea to, you know, spread that in schools. And
over the last 20 years, at least 15 people have gone on to be doing the work that I'm doing. They contacted me all the way back to 20 years ago when so I mean, it does have an impact on certain kids for life.
thank you.
Other questions? There's one over here. Hi.
Hi, Mark Dale. I work for Walgreens Boots Alliance in Hong Kong.
Yes.
How effective or how big an impact do you think it's been making companies put the modern day slavery statement on websites?
Well, a lot of them won't do it still. And it's partly because it's not that they don't want to, they're just afraid that if they do, somebody's going to ask the uncomfortable question, are you doing this because you have something that you're hiding? And so a lot of organizations are waiting for that. The same transition happened in HIV/AIDS 25 years ago. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And then there was an awakening and an opening up. And then everybody said it was okay. I think we're right up at the almost tipping point of companies feeling like it's okay. Because with this pledge, there's, you know, a VF Group and a CBA Bank and hotel chains and so forth that are willing to go through the process of identifying what they're doing and then putting their name on this pledge. When you get to a point where there's about 20 or 25 names, then it becomes easy for a lot more to do it. So there's this waiting game that often takes place. And that's kind of where we are now. We just launched it. A year from now, we'll have 50 names on there for sure, or more.
Other questions? Oh, right here.
Hi, my name's Emma Smith. I have a question, which is how could you stop this? How could you eradicate it completely? What would you need? Do you need $150 billion or?
I think a lot of it has to do with the right people. First of all, I think there has to be a lot more general awareness. How many of you knew 25% of what I was talking about before I said it today? How many of you knew 10%? There's always going to be a few. I mean, in your case, I can understand that. If you don't know about an issue, you're not going to care. How many of you feel like now that you know about it, if there was something you could do, you would do something? Okay, so, you know, the first thing is to create that awareness. Then to basically move in the direction of thinking that 15,000 of us is going to make a difference to accepting some responsibility. My biggest pet peeve with the world is that we all feel like the problems that exist out there belong to a small group of NGOs that are going to address it, whether it's human trafficking or the environment or anything else. We can't do it. We admit we can't do it. So the first thing you need to do is to figure out what your issue is. We all have one. For me, it's human trafficking. It's very clear. For you, it may be the environment. It could be any number of things. Second, commit yourself to doing something. If 10 million people did 10 million small compassionate gestures in whatever it is that's out there, it'd make a big difference. Third is to figure out why you're not doing it. Most of us are scared. We're scared of the unknown. What if I try it and I don't like it? Or, what do I have to offer? Or I'm too busy. Well, the average person in Hong Kong watches 5 hours of TV a day, on their phone 2 hours a day. Come on, there's got to be some time in there. But to incentivize the world to understand and accept the fact that we can have a part of this. And so I think if we had, and I'll give you a very tangible example in the United States. In the United States, if by definition, if you're under the age of 18 and you're in prostitution, you're a trafficking victim. 90% of the police force in the United States don't know that. So they take a 14-year-old girl, lock her up for 2 months, and then she gets a record. She's never able to get a job after that. She's stuck with this particular life and with this. So simply informing the police that if you have a 14-year-old girl who's in prostitution, she goes to a shelter, not to a jail, is an intervention that can be done fairly quickly. You could just do letter writing campaigns. You can put pressure on law enforcement people. You can put pressure on legislators, et cetera, et cetera. Finding those types of things are the types of things that the community can do. But we need to work with the community for those things to happen and help them to understand, okay, this is our next project, this is our next project, et cetera.
Is there one last question? Okay, you could be the last question.
Emma Smith again. Why is there no big benefactor? Like I look at the Gates, Foundation, or Warren Buffett, or what Bono is doing, and we want to eradicate, I don't know, typhoid or malaria or whatever. Why does this not have some? Or maybe they do, but I don't know about it. Is it because it's not? Is it because it's just such a horrible subject that people shy away from it?
I think part of it is that we haven't had the impact that would allow for organizations to feel like they want to invest. What we're dealing with is really hard. Like if you take, I did animal trafficking work for a while. When you find a box of turtles, you take them into the woods and let them go. If you have 15 girls that are taken out of prostitution, you have a responsibility to take care of them. And there's a lot of steps and processes and procedures, and the legal system doesn't make it easy for you. You get caught up in that particular small group of people. And so there's all kinds of constraints that are there simply because the world hasn't made it easy for us collectively to come together to be able to address something like this. Benefactors, you see Humanity United is an example of a foundation. You have the Freedom Fund, you have the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. There are these funds that are out there. But many of them, because of the complexity of what we're dealing with here, again, are only having an impact that is quite small relative to what needs to be done. Now, 66,000 people, for those 66,000, it's great. But what about all of the millions of people who every day, like Gita, wake up and say, where is everybody? I struggle with that every day because, I know what happens to these people. I know what the needs are. You guys have just a little bit of that now, but imagine if you were to sit down with a couple of these victims and listen to their story. You'd be crying. It's just so sad what we're dealing with here. So somehow, and I'll accept responsibility for my sector, we haven't done a good enough job educating the very compassionate, loving, caring, benevolent world that's out there to figure out how to get into your heart and then help you with what do you do next to be a part of the solution. And that's why I do all these talks, is to just see if I can, maybe today there's 1 or 2 people who will walk away and get involved or tell other people, and you don't really know with each audience who you're going to reach with this message. Thank you. Oh.
One more quick question. Can you identify yourself, please?
Naomi Molson, I'm a retired banker. Once you identify someone who's subject to trafficking, some innocent person, to what extent are you trying to offer them a job where they're not going to be exploited or something like that? Because these people, they're identified and then
Yeah. We did a survey in Bangladesh, and 40% of the people that we helped out of human trafficking got re-trafficked. If you don't address the basic thing that got them into that situation, then you end up taking them out of one thing. Within 2 months, they're in need again, and they fall into something else. A lot of what we really try to do with rehabilitation and shelter programs is to ensure that there's a vocational training and a vocational placement element to it. In India, there was a huge hotel chain that said they would take women who left prostitution on as maids. The difficulty was that they turned their sexuality on and they did not have to turn it off. And so they didn't do anything, but people were making passes at them. And so it was dangerous for these girls. So another company came up and said, we have teleconferencing or telemarketing. Can we use it for that? And they did a great job with that. They had to sell themselves in order not to have things. And so they became natural at selling soap and detergent and everything else. And so finding something that isn't giving them a sewing machine where they're competing with people who know how to sew a lot better than they do, but something that's reasonable and worthwhile. There's an organization called Data Motivate that takes these girls, trains them to be technical people, to do Photoshop, photograph things, and even accounting and all kinds of other things. So you take a woman who is perceived to be at the lowest point of society, and then you raise her up, and then she becomes a role model for all of these other girls who are trying to get out. So there are things that can be done, but we need people who are in human resources to help out with how do you make those things happen.
One more, then we do have to go. This is the very last question.
Hi, this is David Kwan, member of the club. I just wonder, have you, by any chance, spoken to any members of the Triad Society in Hong Kong? People who control prostitutes or who may be involved with prostitutes, tycoons who are rumored to be associated with Triad Societies previously or now. Have you spoken to any of these people directly?
Actually, all these are great questions, and this is another good question. I've talked to a lot of criminals, not here in Hong Kong. I just, my mandate is more with the private sector and so forth. But there's really two experts in modern slavery. There's the person who's a victim and the person who's doing the crime. And so if you want to learn about this, you don't get it from me, you get it from them. And so when I was in Bangladesh, we would go into the prisons, and we'd interview these guys. And the first thing they'd say is that I'm an innocent. But most criminals are narcissists. So all I have to do is to say to Ali, Muhammad is the best criminal I ever met. And then all of a sudden he's going to say, well, no, actually I'm better than him. And then they'll tell you all of these things. The interesting point of that is that when I hear about the stories, I feel very sad and compassionate. When I hear these people talk, I get scared. As a parent, I get scared. Because they have no sense of humanity, no sense of caring about these people and so forth. Or at least many of them don't. Having said that, let me just say one other thing about criminals. It's a bell-shaped curve. There's a certain number of criminals who don't know how they got into it, but you can talk them out of it, and they can actually help you on one end. The other end, you have just sheer evil people that need to be in jail, and there's a lot of people in between. If you can hit this side here, get them to work with you, get them to help you, get them to kind of go into the communities, you can talk a certain number of people out of being criminals. I used to go into the brothels all the time and sit down with the pimps and the madams and have talks with them and chat with them and say, what are you guys doing, and all this other stuff. Human beings are human beings, so it's not so black and white as to say that all victims are wonderful and all criminals are terrible. There's kind of a mixture of all kinds of weird combinations of that exist in there. But if if somebody from Triads want to have a conversation with me, I'm happy to sit down, have a beer or a cup of coffee with them, and one other thing. I was in Vietnam 4 years ago. Somebody called me up and said he wanted to meet with me. Well, I thought it was an NGO guy. Went to dinner, had a conversation, talked for an hour. After, I said, well, what's your story? He said, I'm a trafficker. I said, excuse me? Yeah, he says, I traffic women, and he told me all about it. And so I had two choices there. I could get up and run out, or I could sit down and listen to him. I spent another 90 minutes talking to him. kept saying, you guys are ridiculous. Says, you put everything on your website, you got to get everything approved by the donors. If you come anywhere close to us, we'll mutate and we'll just change our business model and so forth. And so, he even handed me his card and said, come after me. It was as arrogant as that. And so, I mean, it was quite an interesting experience. Anyways, thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.